Hello, everyone. My name is CodyCKing, and this is my final project on my long-term paper, the title of which is The Definition of Appalachia, a Geographical and Cultural Review. Also, I'm going to go ahead and apologize preemptively for my odd setup. It was kind of weird getting everything together. Hopefully everything turns out. This was very last minute. Anyway, to begin. So, what is my paper on exactly? Well, Appalachia, the more I researched it and its culture and living in it, actually, I started to realize one thing, and you really cannot separate Appalachia from the mountains of which they're named after. And so, what was originally a paper on the cultures of Appalachia and how they interacted and how they came to be and the stereotypes wherein kind of morphed into how that came to be just from living in the mountains. So, how did the mountains really affect culture and stuff like that? Well, it's all tricky, but the general idea of it is imagine coming into the mountains early on and basically becoming isolated. The mountains in themselves are actually very cozy, and in a way, I kind of attribute some safety to them, and I think that's what a lot of people come to realize, also think when they come to these mountains. But when you're surrounded by a wall, it also kind of keeps things out. And a lot of people, we see this time and time again, reading our papers and whatnot, that isolationism is a very, very controversial uh, uh, processor, however you would call it, that is attributed to Appalachia. Um, and so when dealing with that, I came to my thesis. And my thesis is this: from the mountains comes the culture, and from the culture comes the heart of the mountains. Because without this, bubbling crackpot that is the Appalachian Mountains and all the people pouring into it, and then in a way kind of getting stuck, isolated, and stick together, comes out this new beautiful culture that we now see today. And a lot of it is stereotypes, of course, which is not necessarily a good thing, but not horrible either, I suppose. Um, we kind of have this heart, this unique, this purely American unique sense of culture. So with that in mind, I basically took a geographical approach to studying the culture of Appalachia. All right. So, what is Appalachia exactly? Well, in my research, I referenced a certain line from Richard A. Straw that many of you are familiar with in his introduction to, in his intro. And in it, he asks his professor, what is the history of Appalachia? And the professor said, Appalachia has no history, to paraphrase. And I thought, why is that? I argued, and this is where I start my argument on isolationism and so on, kind of detailing how it's really an unknown land to an extent. Even today, I didn't know anything about Appalachia, and I live here. Um, and so I kind of go on to that and, kind of working why it is kind of like this little land. And a lot of that does come down to economics, actually, which when we looked into the Appalachia Regional Commission and their study of the economical status of all the things, you kind of noticed that the heart of Appalachia, which is mostly Kentucky and West Virginia, was actually really poor, and a lot of that comes down to the mines and so forth shutting down, and other kind of businesses leaving, industrialization, and of course deforestation, and basically just sucking up the resources out of Appalachia, really just tearing down these mountains. Yes, when you oh no, my cat. When you come in to the place and you start destroying it, well, you're running out of resources. But that said, as we also learned, it is steadily improving. But that also means when it kind of has this stereotype about it, and I know this even from living with other Southerners around this place, that a lot of people don't want to go up north. A lot of people don't want to go to the poorer places. I live, just a little bit next to Knoxville, Tennessee, and my girlfriend, she lives in Raccoon Valley, and Raccoon Valley is almost like a dead zone. It's kind of hard to go there. It's a place with a bad reputation. And I do see a lot of the stereotypes that we talk about in the story with people who live there. With it's it's kind of wild seeing what's on literature happen before your eyes. But that's to say, I'm going to sum it up, and it's the worst summation ever. But Appalachia is a unique place with unique people. You really don't have to think about it more than that. But it is a very lame, not very eloquent way of putting it, but that is what I argue Appalachia is. So, that said, economics does not create a culture. What does create a culture is cultures. How do you get a unique culture? Well, you jam all these other cultures together, really. I talk about the history of the people that come into Appalachia, the very first Native Americans who populated the land, specifically the Shawnee and the Cherokee, and how they kind of mixed together with the Germans, the English, the Ulster Scots, and so forth, who basically came to this land that was very unforgiving and had to rely on each other to survive to an extent. And how basically being put through this grinder, a diamond pops out the other side, and it's the beautiful Appalachia culture that we know today, which is a lot of stereotypes. I do talk a lot about stereotypes in my paper, specifically about the barefoot, overall wearing bearded man, churning butter and making chairs, the kind of type that I believe the poet that we're familiar, Miller, who talks about in his poem, and I mentioned the Briar losing touch with tradition, and how it often seems that even while the people who live in Appalachia have this culture, sometimes they're not even really a part of it, but they're expected to be a part of it. And sometimes I know this going down some of the deeper lands that a lot of people have to really brazenly put themselves off as authentic in order to sell things, especially at storefronts and stuff like that. I see it all the time in grocery chains, actually, which is kind of weird. So, yeah. So back to geography and how that kind of plays a part in the thing. I talk about how important is Appalachia to the rest of the United States. Well, it's very important. First of all, it sticks out like a sore thumb out of the United States. It is a massive landmass. It touches roughly 13 states in total. That is 26% of the United States. That means like roughly 26% of people living there who have written books, made art, literature, and so forth, either made it about Appalachia or took place in Appalachia or something like that. That is a huge number. It's kind of hard to quantify how much of an impact it would have on the United States just because there's so many people who live there. Even poverty and all that stuff taking out of the thing. So it was then I started thinking, what kind of art comes out of here? And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of art is movies. And so I thought of what are their two most important movies to Appalachia? Well, one is pretty optimistic. One is October Sky, which I don't know if a lot of people have seen. I saw it once when I was a little kid, and it's a pretty good movie, and it's about some kids who live in Appalachia who are being pressured into working into a mine, even though it's not their dream. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The other movie, which I think a lot more people have know about, is Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, where a pack of men have to fight off a raging pack of Appalachian bandits, essentially. I then kind of summarize everything up and put it in a nice little neat package, and I restate my points in my conclusion. And the general conclusion is the Appalachians, the mountains make the people, and the people in turn make the mountains. Thank you very much.